Good morning, everybody. So this is our Q&A number 7, I believe. And I'm not at home. I'm in Phoenix today, so we're using my laptop. And because I'm on vacation, I don't have any actual news to go over. The official format of these Q&As is I would go over the news that we have from the previous week, but no news because we haven't been working. All right. Just enjoying our trip here. Did get to go to a jam session. One thing I'll say is, just for those who may not know this, when I'm on vacation, I don't practice. I see people on Facebook all the time talking about how do they work that out? How do they, and you know what? I think my opinion about practicing on vacation was formed when I heard about this guy that practiced on his honeymoon. And you know what? To me, and I don't mean to offend any of you guys. If someone's watching this and you practiced on your honeymoon, you know what? The exception to what I'm talking about is I did hear somebody say that him and his wife both were musicians and they both practiced on their honeymoon kind of sort of together, right? That's different. Okay, that's something you guys are doing together. Okay. But yeah, I mean, you gotta have a life first before you start playing this thing. If trumpet comes first in your life, that's a sad, sad life. I don't care how much you like trumpet, that's still a sad life. If trumpet comes first before everything you do, if it comes first before all the people in your life, that's just sad. So no, when I go on vacation, and I don't even care how long the vacation is, sometimes I go to South Africa and for a month. And the reason we go for so long is because it's just so expensive for the flights, right? So we don't like it doesn't make sense to go down there for 2 weeks and spend that kind of money. So we go for a full month, and I might practice once or twice while I'm there. And I've been doing that way ever since. I don't believe in practicing like that's the most important thing in your life. And you know what the thing is? You don't get any reward for that. The people who make trumpet the absolute first thing in their life, I'm so dedicated to this, it's going to be first in my life. First before my wife, first before my family, first before my kids, first before my health, right? I'm putting trumpet first in every way, right? Those people actually don't normally sound very good. It's not like they're getting, and the ones that do sound good, how much better are they than the guys that don't do that? They're not that much better, So anyway, that's my rant. I'm only telling you that because I am on vacation. I just played a little bit at the beginning of this video, and I didn't have any warm up for that. I went to a jam session on Thursday night. I didn't warm up for that. If I had like a gig, like something hard, I might warm up for that, right? Let's say, because I'm playing at my uncle's church tomorrow, right? If he had like a full orchestra as his church and they wanted me to play lead, I might warm up for that. Other than that, I'm not touching my horn, right? All right, so our first question, how can I prepare for a top chair at Region Orchestra? Well, first thing I would say is if you want to be top chair at Region, you should strive for top chair at State. Set your sights farther than what you want to shoot for it. Because here's the thing, human nature is we always fall short of the mark. Not always, but yeah, I mean, it's natural to fall short. It's natural to say, and you know what? We do this in sports, right? I remember when I was doing the track and field stuff in, junior high, junior high and elementary school. But even back at that age, they tell you don't run to the finish line. Don't run to the finish line. Pick a point behind the finish line and run to that point. And same thing with Bruce Lee, right? Bruce Lee, I saw a video with him and they said, how do you punch through a brick wall? And he says, I don't aim at the brick wall. I aim 6 inches behind the brick wall. So that's the first comment I would have, is that if you want to make first chair at Region, you better be ready to make first chair at State. That's what you should be striving for, is to go that far with it. Okay, I think what happens a lot of times is people say they think that State is actually more competitive than Region, and that's not actually true. The top chair is just as competitive at State as it is at Region. Let that sink in. The top chair is still the top chair. Getting in the band, that's a different story. So, but that's not what you said. You said, how do I get top chair? Well, to get top chair, you got to be all-state material and top chair all-state material. Now, here's the thing to keep in mind also, is that there's no guarantee ever. There's a video that I have out talking about competition in music. I strongly recommend you watch that that video. Type as a search Eddie Lewis competition in music, right? And watch that video, and because I think it's good to strive for top chair. I think it's bad to ever think that there's anything you could do to guarantee that you get first chair. Okay, because that's not up to you, that's up to the judges. You don't have much say over that. But that video would explain that better than what I can do here in this. Okay, so let's talk about musically, what can you do to get first chair? Oh, very good. Very good, you saw it. I was listening to a podcast the other day with the guy that's in the Met Orchestra, Metropolitan Opera Orchestra. And he was saying something that clarifies a little bit of what I've been saying all this time. I always tell my students, you have to put your heart and your soul into it. Hey, Richard, how are you doing? He says you have to put your heart and soul into it. And I mean, I'm saying I have to put your heart and soul into it, and you express yourself. And if you express yourself, then you have more of a chance of connecting with the judges, right? Okay, here's the problem. And this guy pointed this out, and I hadn't thought of this before. And if you're being strategic, this is important. If you express yourself so well that all of your little quirks come out, that could actually backfire on you. Okay? And I haven't thought about this before, but this guy said today, and so he's talking about auditioning for orchestras, right? And he says that today, contrasting it with how it was when he did it, right? He says today you have to play middle of the road so that you don't offend anybody. How much is that like our society today? Right? You gotta watch what you say. It's just like that in the auditions, right? You gotta walk the middle of the road. I'm not saying don't be expressive. Everything I've been saying about that is still true. But maybe rein in the offensive bits, right? So like if you have a vibrato that is just a little wild, maybe you want to tame the vibrato a little bit. If you don't have any vibrato at all, and that's your style, that's what resonates with you, probably don't want to go that route either. Okay? So when it comes to that stuff, you do have to be. Now, it doesn't change what I've been saying. So I believe that, okay, so I have this book. You guys know that I don't just pitch my books. I've got, I think, 400 or 500 videos now. And some of them are actually videos that I put on my books page. That's not the same thing. Other than that, the amount of times that I say, okay, so the stuff you're asking about is in my book. Go buy my book. I don't do that, right? I think I said that in the last Q&A. But I have a book, and I'm not pitching the book. And in fact, don't buy the book. I'm just telling you what's in the book, okay? The book is meant to be practiced between the time that you finish your solo contest, which is for most people in February, and July when the music comes out, right? So I have a set of etudes, but in the introduction for that, I tell you that the way that you get to be all-state material, and this includes also how do you get to be first chair, is to show more musical maturity. You want to, okay, and here's how I like to say it to my students. If you're a junior high student, you want to sound like a high school student. If you're a high school student, you want to sound like a great college player. If you're a college player, you want to sound like a pro. We're talking maturity here. And what makes you mature? Is it that you played fast? No. You see what I'm saying? It's not the impressive stuff that impresses young people that gets you those higher spots. Okay? That's not how you get the higher spot. You get the higher spot by showing musical maturity. All right? Now, what is musical maturity? Musical maturity, we're looking at having a good vibrato. A good, appropriate vibrato, appropriate for the style that you're playing. We're looking at having beautiful, appropriate phrasing. We want phrasing. We want these phrases that start. I don't know if the camera is flipped or not when you guys see it. We want phrasing that starts low, comes high, and then resolves. And that's something that takes work. That's why I have that book. Once again, don't buy that book. It's the wrong time of the year to practice that book, okay? Don't buy it's called the All-State Prep book. Everything you're supposed to practice until the music comes out, okay? But don't buy the book. It's the wrong time of the year. This is the time when you want to spend time practicing the music. The music comes out on, I think, on Monday. Not this Monday, the week after. Okay, so yes, don't buy that book. But yes, the stuff that we cover in those books, we've got vibrato, we've got phrasing, we've got rhythms. Like you want to master your feel for the 2 versus 3, the 3 versus 4 in the rhythms. You want to master that. You want to your technique level. Now this can't. So you know what I will say is that when the music comes out, and this book I will recommend that you get. I have a book called Total Tonalization. And actually, there's a couple other tonalization books depending on the range. The Tonal Tonalization Study book only goes up to a G above the staff. There are tonalization studies books. Actually, do you know what? Now that I'm thinking about it, because we're moving our website to a different format, those other books might not be available yet. But yes, so total tonalization studies, you take the etudes, look at what key they're in, and then practice the tonalization studies that go with those keys. Master those tonalization studies first before you practice the music. That's going to go a long way to preventing you from making mistakes in the key signature. Now, maybe it's easy key signature. We haven't seen the music yet. But let's say hypothetically it's 4 sharps, and you know, even if you've mastered that scale, right? If you can do that, you still haven't mastered that key. And it's quite possible that you'll start practicing that music. And so here's what we want to avoid completely. We want to avoid ever practicing wrong notes in the music. So that's why we want to do the scales first, to help us avoid the wrong notes. Okay? There's other stuff you can take into account. I don't let my students practice full tempo. We do 2/3 tempo until about 2 weeks before the audition. That sounds frightening, right? A lot of people say, well, I will never be able to play fast enough. That's not how it works. If you practice right, you can play fast enough. Okay? All right. So I hope that answers your question. Now, there's more to what it, I have actually a whole system of 7 stages for working on a piece of music. And my students, when they do the 7 stages correctly and follow all the steps, they always do well. Okay? And what I shared with you is part of that. There's more to it. But yeah, those are the things that I would suggest for getting you to first chair. All right, let's look at another question. What do you think about the All-State Etudes being in the Voxman book? Voxman? I didn't know they were in the Voxman. I thought it was Verm this year. Let me check real quick. I don't think it's Voxman. Okay, I'm doing a real quick looking at band, All-State, band, audition, whatever, okay. Let me just do a search. Okay. Texas All-State audition music. There we go. The books, I'm going to books. Scrolling down to trumpet and cornet. Yes, it's the Verm book. And we say Verm because it's, I might have pronounced it wrong in the past. It's Verm. So that's the answer to that question. That's all right. Okay. Um, you know what I like about the Vern book is that there's so many etudes, right? I'm glad they use that because then the chance of them picking something you already practiced is very slim. Unless you're a great, great, great player that can just learn a whole bunch of those etudes, not likely, right? Okay, next question. Would you recommend your students to study classical music before moving into jazz? You know, to a certain degree. I have 7 levels that I teach on the classical side. Um, so I have what I call the pioneer level, which is like beginner, and the range only goes up to C. Then I have pioneer, which goes up, no, I mean not pioneer, tyro, which goes up to E in the staff, the fourth space C. Then trumpet player, which is G up to the staff, G above the staff, and um, and that's not just range. That's just it's coordinated with the range. And by the time they get to the player level, they can play 8 notes. They can play every key. They can basic reading, basic technique. The reason I call it the trumpet player level is because once you get to that level, you've got your foot in the door, and just about anything that's out there you can play. It just might take you a long time to learn it, right? So the objective of the higher levels is to make it faster so that you don't have to spend years practicing one piece of music, right? So I do, when my students come to me and they want to learn jazz and they've never played the instrument before, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll get them on the classical stuff just to that level. Then they have the basic skills. So in that regard, it's not really even, you couldn't even really call it classical. It's just trumpet playing, right? But yeah, I think you have to have some basic skills. Is it possible to just learn jazz? I've had students that said, no, I won't do all that stuff. And you know what? Here's the way I run the lesson is you're the boss. I see myself as a teacher. You know, if you were going to go on a safari in the African jungle, you hire a guide, right? A safari guide. But you're the boss. You're the one that hired the guide. But I promise you, if the guide tells you, don't stick your hand in that hole, you probably should not stick your hand in that hole, right? Does that make sense? So when I teach, I'm the guide, but they're the boss. And if they say, no, absolutely not, I will not do any classical stuff, I want to start with jazz, then that's where we start. Okay? It's possible to go that way. I have done it that way. Let me tell you this, that the students I've taught that way didn't last long. Okay? And so I do recommend that we do it the other way. I do recommend that you get some skills first. You know, there's a summer jazz workshop I used to teach for 3 years in Houston. It's a wonderful workshop in Houston, and it's basically jazz. They have like 5 different courses and then a rehearsal. So, and I think if I remember right, in the morning it's the classes, and in the afternoon it's the rehearsal. And they do music theory, they do jazz improv, they do these 5 different classes. What I was teaching was orchestration, right? How do you teach orchestration to people that don't even know all their notes yet? Right? But you know, here's the thing is, so my boss for that camp, the jazz camp, right? I went to him. I said, I don't know how to do this. How do you teach a class about orchestration? That's like a college level class. How do you teach them about orchestration when they don't even know all the notes yet? And the guy said, you just make it work. Is that ideal? No, I don't think that's ideal. But I think it worked for them. And a lot of times, you know what? A class like that is just really more of an introduction. And you know what cool way to introduce younger students to a higher level of musical thought than to teach them about orchestration and jazz improvisation, even when they're technically not ready for it. So what I ended up doing was teaching more concepts and less hands-on material stuff. Anyway, the short answer to your question, I would say I would recommend getting skills. Now, whether you call that classical music or not, I think most of the time we call it classical because the guys that are going to teach that are going to be classical players. So, but there is a problem. Now, see, for me, it's not that big of a deal because I'm classical and jazz. I make most of my living playing on the commercial side, the jazz side. If I were to give a percentage, I think only about 15 to 20% of my work is classical. Now, I'm classically trained. All of my education is on the classical side. So I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm talking about. When I play the gigs, I'm playing appropriately. Okay? It's not like I can't play that stuff. And that's why I still get called for those gigs, right? So for me to start someone with classical and move them to jazz is not that big of a deal. But what if you're starting with a classical teacher who doesn't teach jazz, who doesn't really know anything about jazz? Then there might be a bit of a sloppy transition. So how would I recommend, if that was the scenario, if you have that scenario where you're taking from a classical teacher before you learn jazz, I would saturate my ears with like 20 hours a week. I might be exaggerating, but however much listening you can do to the great jazz musicians. Listening and listening and listening and listening. As much jazz music as you can so that the style that you're learning from this classical guy doesn't dig too deep into what you want to do. There's some really, even just the way we read the music, and this is just off the top of my head. There's a bunch of things like this, but we have this articulation, right? That's in the jazz world we call it a rooftop. Okay, a rooftop accent. It's the opposite in classical from what it is in jazz. A lot of people don't know that. In jazz, that's supposed to be a fat note, accented but fat. That, right? And in classical, and I'm not going to try to imitate that, but in classical, it's more secco, right? It's more dry. It's more, in fact, do you know what? I think that let me back up on what I just said. Do you know what? In classical, I just read somewhere that said that that type of accent is just a stronger accent. So if you have a series of in classical music, a series of eighth notes that have accents, and then you have one of those rooftops over that, that would be a more accented than just an accent. Right? We would have more like that. That's what I just read. A lot of this stuff is very subjective. Okay, but yes, there's stuff like that the classical guys teach, that if your objective is to learn jazz, they could be pushing you in the wrong direction. Another big thing is the The classical guys today, now this wasn't true 30 years ago. This wasn't true 30 years ago. But the classical guys today have this very bizarre way of separating all the notes. And that does not carry over into the jazz music. Jazz, the phrasing in jazz, you want all of the notes to spill one into the other. Okay? Every note spills so that it's connected, one long airstream. And the classical guys have this way of phrasing. And when I get someone who's trained in classical and they want to learn jazz, a lot of times that's the biggest thing we have to stop, because that separation that they get when they tongue creates what we call Ricky-tick swing. Okay? Because they're separating the notes so much. If I play a figure, right? I just tongued all that. Let me see. It's hard for me to imitate this stuff. And here's the thing. I told you I only play about 15 to 20% classical stuff. I think this articulation thing where they do so much separation, I think that's the biggest difference between the way I play and they play. And it's quite possible that I don't get more calls for that stuff because of this phrasing thing, that separation, because I can't do that. I can't do what it is they're doing. And you know what? Because of that, I think it's better that they don't call me. Right? If I can't get myself to tongue like that, then it makes sense that they should not call me, because I should not, if I'll mess the whole feel up. Okay? So let me try to do that phrasing. See how there's a gap between the notes? Ba, ba, da, 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 right? Yeah, what we should be doing is. Anyway, you get this. You hear that? That's a much smoother. Every note spilling one into the next. So yeah, that's what happens if you go with a classical guy. You have to be real careful with that. And the cure for that is to make sure you're listening to a lot of jazz. All right, next. Do you practice not missing or cracking notes? If you do, then what do you work on? No, I don't practice that as a separate part of what we do. No. So what you're talking about is called accuracy. There are certain conventions that I follow that increase accuracy. It's a complicated issue, but it can be. So cracking notes can be caused by several different problems. Okay? So how do you know which problem you're having? Well, you have to figure it out, right? There's no one size fits all when it comes to accuracy. But there are certain conventions. One of the conventions is, and I know it sounds like I'm plugging my book, but this is one of the benefits of my tonalization studies. Okay? When you practice the tonalization studies, it improves your ear. When you improve your ear, you crack fewer notes. Okay, so that's the first thing I would say. Practice the tonalization studies. The second thing I would say is that you have to practice slow. People who practice fast play sloppy. I'm going to say that again so that it sinks in. People who practice fast perform sloppy. And what I define as sloppy is cracked or missed or mistake. Cracked notes, missed notes, mistakes on an average of about one per measure. Okay? Someone who has an average of one mistake per measure, and that includes the cracked notes, that's the result of practicing too fast. Okay? So that's the next thing I would say, is when you're practicing your music, I tell my students 2/3 of the desired tempo. So if you have a song, if you have an A2 that's supposed to be 100 beats per minute, you should set a limit for yourself. You don't practice any faster than 66 beats per minute. Okay? Now, like I said, the reason you're cracking notes might be physical. You might be playing a mouthpiece that's not the right size for you, and that will cause you to crack notes. How do we know that? We don't know that, right? You have to do experiments to find this stuff out. Now, what I mean by wrong size, if the diameter is too big or too small, if the mouth, so like the difference between a 5 and a 1, or a 3 and a 10, okay? If you're playing on the wrong diameter for you, you will crack more notes. But wait, that doesn't mean go out and buy a bunch of mouthpieces, okay? You want to experiment and find out if that's what's wrong. Find somebody that you can borrow a mouthpiece for 5 minutes. Someone who has a different mouthpiece. See if you crack notes on that. Experiment. Don't go spending a lot of money on mouthpieces. Okay? Here's another thing that can make you crack notes. It makes me crack notes. Okay? Is your trumpet angle. You know how the band directors are always telling you, put your horn up, put your horn up, put your horn up? Well, what if you have an overbite? You know, all the way through high school, in order for me to get my horn up the way they told me, I'm going to give you a demonstration. I had to play like this. I had to arch my back because my horn points down. Okay, if I point the horn up, if I point the horn up, I will crack notes. And how did I figure this out? Like I said, you have to do the experiments. Try pointing it down. Here's another thing along those same lines. If you don't pivot, if you hold the horn static and don't move. So let me give you another demonstration. I'm going to play arpeggios going up and down. I didn't warm up. Now I have a very slight pivot. I remember taking lessons with one lesson with Jeff Curnow, and he pivots like crazy, a lot more than I do. And he's famous. I'm not famous, okay? So, so pivoting, if you need to have a pivot and you're not pivoting and you're just holding the horn static, you will crack notes. So like I said, it's a complex issue. Now, a lot of people will say that the reason you crack notes is because you're not hearing the note. That's always an issue as well. Okay? That's always an issue as well. So another thing from my books that will help you with crack notes is my lip slurs. Okay? That's any of the lip slurs from my routine books, the Daily Routines book, the Chops Express book. Those will help you with accuracy. Okay? But like I said, I would be a fool to say this is the answer without ever hearing you, without watching you, without knowing anything about you. For all I know, you might be one of those guys that doesn't practice, that you've never practiced any scales before, that you don't do lip slurs. How would I know? right? Or maybe you are an upstream player. And maybe I've seen this happen. People will learn the pivot thing, but only learn it shallowly, right? They have shallow information about the pivot. They don't know that some people have the opposite pivot. And they'll force their student that has an upstream embouchure to pivot downstream. And that player will crack all kinds of notes all over the place. Okay? Yes, Richard, you're welcome. All right. So let me see. What else? Any other questions? Let me make sure I hit all these already. Yeah, the Arbon etudes are fun. I like all etudes, even the ones I don't like. That sounds funny. If you got a whole day, how would you practice? How would a practice schedule look like for students who want to be professional players? I have this thing that I do. Okay, I'll get to that after I answer this question. I have this thing that I do, this visualization. Now, I'm not often into visualization because I don't think. I guess it depends on what kind of visualization. If it's something abstract, I'm not into visualization. So, like, I don't want someone to tell me, pretend you're on a beautiful desert island. That's not going to help me at all, and so I'm not into that. But I do like visualization where you visualize things that actually you have in your life, right? Maybe that's not actually called visualization. Anyway, there's this thing that I do. Those books that you can buy, and I think they're called explosion books, where you can look at an object. One of the last ones I saw was a submarine, and you can turn the page and you see deeper into the submarine. It's for children, right? It helps the children see the inside of things, okay? And I like to do that with an imaginary career. So you take the individual and you say, imagine that you're a professional trumpet player, that, your life has already passed. And imagine that that someone can look at your life, your timeline. And you imagine that from the beginning of the time when you start playing trumpet to the day you retire. And I have them dissect. So, like, let's dissect what it looks like 20 years from now. Let's dissect 10 years from now. Now let's dissect today. Is what you're doing today consistent with what someone would do if they're a pro? So, anyway, that's how I visualize this stuff. That's how I got to where I was. I don't believe you have to do what I'm going to explain to you for your whole life. I don't believe that. There's this thing called the 10,000 hour rule, that you have to work at something for 10,000 hours. It took me a lot longer than 10,000 hours. It took, and I think the reason it took me so long was because what I was trying to do was so spread out. But I think I'm closer to 20,000 hours, but I understand what the guy's talking about. We want to have 10,000 hours of what I'm about to describe to you, okay? The daily schedule that I used to have when I was pursuing this 20,000 hours, I would get up, and first thing in the morning after I did my Bible reading, first thing in the morning before breakfast, is I would practice my routine. Now, I don't know how much you know about my alternating days thing. Back in those days, I only took one day off a week. I try to do that now, but stuff happens, so I get more than one day a week most of the time. Um, but back in those days, I was pretty religious about following the schedule. So depending on what day it was during the week, my routine, morning routine, might have been as long as 2.5 hours or as short as 30 minutes. And the 2.5 hour routine would have gone all the way up to the G above high C. For a while, it was going up to super C, but I decided I don't like that anymore. I can still play those notes and I still use them in my improv, but I hate practicing that stuff. So I backed it down. I think it was about 5 years that I was practicing those notes, and I just scaled it back to the G above high C. That's more normal for me. Those other notes, especially when I'm playing by myself at home, it's just disgusting. I can't stand the sound of that stuff. Okay. And maybe I should use that as a way to like improve myself. But still, just the idea of trying to improve my high notes, it just doesn't appeal to me. Not when I have all the high notes I need to play the gigs that I play. And by the way, I know this is a tangent to a tangent. I'm a lead player professionally. Most of what I do is lead stuff. I told you I do 10%, not 10, 15 to 20% of classical music. All the rest of it's lead. So don't get the wrong impression. When I say I hate practicing the high notes, I'm not saying I can't do it or that, when I say I should probably improve, I'm talking about those notes between G above high C and super C. Anyway, getting back to the point. So yes, after I do my physical routine, first thing in the morning, I'll have breakfast and do my email and all that stuff. Okay? However long it took me to do that practice, that's how long I would rest before I practice again. So if it was the day that I did a 2.5 hour routine, I would not practice again until 2.5 hours of rest have occurred. Okay? Then the next practice session would be, well, I say practice session. After that 2.5 hour, I do a half hour, half hour practice, half hour rest, half hour practice, half hour rest. I do that twice. This is back in the old days. Okay. So, and that would be for my technique work. So the early morning stuff is physical. The next practice sessions would be for technique. Okay. Technique, in my book, technique includes scales, arpeggios, interval studies, stuff like that. And when I say interval studies, a lot of that stuff, that really, really advanced stuff, that's just hard stuff. And we practice that to take our technique to another level. Okay. So then the third kind of session during the day would be music practice. And that's where the majority of my time gets spent. And I'll do 15 minutes off, 15 minutes on, 15 minutes off for the rest of the day. Now, of course, there are times when we have other commitments, but I'll tell you this, because my big day was always Tuesday. So the day that I did that 2.5 hour practice session in the morning was always on Tuesday. There's bands that I had to quit because they either had gigs on Tuesday or they had rehearsals on Tuesday. I actually prioritized my Tuesday practice over my gigs. Let that sink in, right? I hope that makes sense. I would turn down a gig, turn down a rehearsal so that Tuesday That was the most important practice day of my week. And I would practice from the time I woke up in the morning until it was time to go to bed. All day. Practice all day. The rest of the week wasn't like that, because I put time limits and range limits on the rest of the week. Okay, so the way I do this is very kind of complicated, but it works. All right, I hope that answers your question. Now, also included in that, I'm assuming that you were talking about um, practice stuff, but you have to have listening to, you have to do listening, there's all kinds of other work that needs to be done as a trumpet player. Transcriptions, stuff like that. There's work that's got to be done. And you find as much time to do that as you can. All right, what's next? Okay, so do you support PKK? I'm gonna have to look up and see what that is. I don't even know what that is. Well, if it's what I think it is, if it's what's coming up, I will have to say that has no business on my, if it's what it says here. I don't do politics in on my channel, so if it's a music thing, you can ask me again and spell out what that is. I don't, but what's coming up on the Google search is political, so I'm not going to make any comments about that. The only time I talk about politics in the context of music is when it has something to do with you getting better on your horn. I am not one of those people who wants to use my music to sway the political stuff. I have my political beliefs. But we're not going to talk about that. Okay? Does that make sense? We won't talk about that. The only time we'll talk about that is if, and I can't remember a time in the last 4 or 5 years that I've done this. The only time we'll talk about that is if it's going to help your playing. And like I said, I can't recall ever doing that. Well, thank you. Next question, how often do you transcribe solos? And if you needed to work on 251s, I don't know what 251s are. What solo would you transcribe? Oh, 251s. I 251s. 251s. Okay, why do you need to work on 251s? Yes, the answer is yes. Work on 251s, and the short answer is either Charlie Parker or Clifford Brown. If you need to work on quote unquote 251s, you know, the way I teach, we don't do 251s. We do licks, but only for a small part. Do I do transcriptions? You know, I kind of stopped doing. How do I answer that question? I've done so many transcriptions in my lifetime. It started with me doing jazz transcriptions like what you're talking about for my educational purposes, right? And everybody should do that, okay? But you know what happened is I started getting paid to write transcriptions. And, you know, I transcribed it was 120 tunes for one band. And I transcribed, it was all early jazz music. Okay, I shouldn't say that. Some of them were my originals, my original arrangements. But yeah, at least like 100 transcriptions of early jazz music. And I transcribed the bass parts. I transcribed the trumpet parts. I transcribed the clarinet, the saxophone. I transcribed every part. And so what's happened for me personally is that because I do so much of this stuff professionally, I haven't actually been doing so much for myself. Would I write it out? Okay, you know what somebody told me? I was doing a transcription in the 80s, and this older, more mature musician comes up to me and he asks me, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm writing out this transcription." And he says, "Why are you doing that?" And he says, I told him, I said, "Because I like this one lick." And he says, "Why don't you write out that one lick?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, that's a great idea." So, you know, you don't have to write the whole thing. It depends on what you want to do. If you're working on your ear, write the whole thing. If you struggle with transcriptions for the solo, start with transcribing tunes instead. And I recommend, like the old bebop tunes, get some Charlie Parker stuff that you don't already know the notes for, bebop stuff like that. And transcribe those heads if you struggle with the solos. That's a great way to get started. But yes, we want to transcribe. It's good for your ear training. It's good for getting the language. Do I practice the heads in all keys? Not every head in every key, no. You know what? There's too many tunes. There's too many tunes. So the tunes that I practice in every key, and this is kind of new for me, but it's working, and I'm very happy with it. The tunes I practice in every key are, in fact, I'll pull up a list right now. I can read it to you. Let me pull this up real quick. And the reason I practice these tunes specifically is because they have qualities. The harmonies have qualities that I want to have absolute command of in every key, right? So why am I not seeing it? Let me see here. Maybe on the practice tabs. Practice. Jazz tune. Oh, I can't find it. That's not cool. Anyways, I'll try to do it by memory. I practice in every key autumn leaves. I practice in every key rhythm changes, and I try to do as many heads over rhythm changes as possible in every key. I practice the blues in every key. I practice the bossa nova Black Orpheus in every key. I practice, I can't remember the name of the one tune. It's a Duke Ellington tune. I do that in every key because it's got the kind of turnarounds I'm looking for. I practice minor blues in every key, and I practice giant steps in every key. I might be missing one or two, but those are the ones I do in every key. Did you hear? Okay, so the transcribing chords is a whole different level of transcription. How do I feel about that? I can hear chords. So, when we transcribe, okay, here's what I have to say. When you listen to someone's interpretation of the chords, and then you look at what they're actually playing, a good jazz pianist will play the chords in a way that is kind of vague. So You get what I'm saying, right? So if he's got a C major 7 chord, he might put an A in there. He might put a D. He might even put an F sharp. And depending on just how good he is, there might even be other notes in there like A flats and stuff like that. Stuff that's not written into the harmony, right? Okay? So when you're transcribing that kind of jazz, what are you going to write? You're not going to come up with the same chord that the guy wrote. So I hope that's making sense. The guy that wrote the tune, if it's a more modern tune, you won't end up with the same chords written on your sheet that as what they wrote on the original. Okay? And it's true, the same thing is true with the bass part. So the chords that you write aren't actually going to be accurate. Okay? So so as a trumpet player, we do the best that we can. You will and let me tell you about working with chord players. They will always look at you like you don't know what you're talking about. Okay? When it comes to harmony, they will always look at you like you don't know what you're talking about. Okay? So in your transcription, and you know, the first 20 years of my career, I just assumed that they knew what they were talking about because they're chord players. But they have the same problem doing the transcription of the harmonies as you do. So, you know, just because they play piano or they play guitar doesn't mean they have a better grasp of the harmonies than you do. Really, when you write that chord symbol down, that's just your opinion. And when they write the chord symbol down, it's just their opinion. So I do think it's good practice. I do think, you know, but it is a higher level of thing, a higher level of transcription. And I don't think that you should hold yourself to that standard from the beginning. You know, you should do at least a dozen or 20 transcriptions before you start trying to put the harmonies in if it's a more modern tune. Okay, did you ever experience plateaus? You know, I stopped. Okay, so there's different kinds of plateaus, right? You can have physical plateaus, and you can have mental musical plateaus. You're welcome. Glad to answer your question. You have physical plateaus and mental plateaus, musical plateaus. It's like different kinds of plateaus. When it comes to the physical stuff, you can minimize plateaus by making sure that you alternate resting with getting tired. If you maximize your contrast between resting and getting fatigued back and forth like that, you will have fewer plateaus on the physical side. Okay? That's where those plateaus come from. The plateaus on the physical part of it come from either not resting enough or not pushing yourself enough to fatigue. Okay? Those people, you know, there's people that say never practice tired. That's got plateau written all over it. Okay? If you go with the plateau, if you go with that belief that says never practice tired, then you will have plateaus, physically speaking, in terms of the strength and stuff like that. Okay? So that's the physical. Musically, plateaus happen And I believe they are unavoidable. I think the way you fix the plateau, musically speaking, is to make sure. Now you can't get rid of them completely, but you can minimize them a little bit by being more organized with your music practice. You know, when you practice a piece of music, it's not just for now. Change that attitude. That piece of music gets added to your repertoire. It's not just for now. The day you start playing that music, that's for the rest of your life. And in order to live that way, you have to be organized about it. You don't just put the music in a file somewhere and collect. There's a lot of people like that, right? They collect libraries. They can't play the music, but they've got a big library. Okay? That music should never come out of your repertoire. And you have to be organized in a way that you keep coming back to that music. And that's not possible if you're not organized. And then the mental stuff, that's just normal too. But you were probably talking about physical. So the mental stuff, life is tough, man. Life is tough. And sometimes you just should be happy that you've got a plateau and you're not just backsliding. Right? All right. I hope that answered your question. What else? How do you practice lip trills, such as the one in this year's jazz number one etude? So I don't remember the page number. There's a page in the Arbin book that I recommend for that. I want to say either exercise 22 or page 22, but it's in the lip slur section. And by the way, it's not a lip trill. Not to be a jerk about it, but don't think of it as a lip trill. Change that terminology in your head to a shake, because that's what it is. It is not a lip trill. There's a difference between a lip trill and a shake. Okay? And I would also recommend that you listen to as much big band music that has shakes in it as possible. Okay? Listen to that stuff so you can hear that it's not a lip trill. Okay? And I know you probably already know that it's a shake and not a lip trill. But I do believe in the power of the spoken word. And I believe that when you call it a lip trill, the chances are it will come out like a lip trill. Okay? So you can make the first step by not calling it a lip trill. Okay? Call it a shake. And so look in the Arbin book. What I like about this series of exercises is it starts low. And so I'm going to play, and I think it starts on 1 and 3. Now that is a lip slur, right? But we want to do that up, and it starts on that one and it goes higher, 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 and then the next exercise I think goes up to high C. If you don't have the skill for that, then you can't do a shake. Okay? So I recommend go to that page. It's a whole one page, 2 exercises. The first exercise takes about this much of the page. The second exercise is about this much. This exercise gradually goes higher and higher. The last part is the part that's over the staff. I hope that makes sense. But that's what I've been giving my students. Okay? And you want to work on your flexibility. Now, the difference between a lip trill and a shake is how clean it is, right? A lip trill right? Has a very clean back and forth. A shake, you hear that? It's like smeared all over the place. Okay? A shake is more smeared, and a lip trill is very clean. Okay? All right. So, any more questions? I don't mind. So I'm on vacation right now. I don't have to go teach right now. I haven't had breakfast yet, but if you guys have any more questions, I will answer them. Um, going. So, what defines a great teacher in your opinion? Okay, great teacher. Well, first of all, that's subjective, right? And that's why you said your opinion. So what's a great teacher to me is going to be different as a great teacher for you. So for example, let me tell you this. I do not consider a great teacher someone who feels like they have to help my personal life. I don't consider a great teacher someone who's going to guide me in politics. That's why, I'm a Christian, right? I don't use my trumpet teaching as a way to convert people, because that's not a good teacher. Okay? So stuff like that has no business in the. You want to go according to my definition of a good teacher, stuff like that. And for that matter, if someone else wants to sell me, use his lessons to sell me equipment, that's not a good teacher. Okay? So what is a good teacher? In my opinion, you know what? It's hard for me to answer that question because I had so many great teachers and they were all great for different reasons. So let's go backwards with this. Like my last great teacher, and I don't do this for my students. my last teacher, he was a wonderful teacher. He was a second trumpet in the Houston Symphony, and I was working on orchestral rep with him. At that time, I wanted to be an orchestral trumpet player. And he would come to my house. He would bring me copies of music from the Houston Symphony Library. So I could have the original parts instead of reading out of a excerpt book. So this guy went over and above what a typical teacher would do. It was just amazing. And you know what else? He was the first champion of my books. He took an interest in what I did, so much of an interest that when I started publishing my books, like my daily routine book, I still get meet people today who were his students and say, hey, I've been working out of your book since 1990 because that guy, got that guy in the, Dick Schaefer, his name is Dick Schaefer. Dick Schaefer was teaching his students out of my books. When does that happen, huh? So that, to me, that's a great teacher. And so I had another teacher in El Paso, Sam Trimble, and he was first trumpet in the El Paso Symphony. I think I was his assistant, and I played my first professional recording sessions were with him, and so I played a lot of gigs with him, and we bonded, we were close, and I mean bonded musically, right? That's what matters, right? And I was so much influenced by the way he played and the way he taught, that people were calling me Sam Trimble Jr. because we just spent so much time working with music together. We played A Soldier's Tale in together. I think it was the UTEP chamber orchestra, and there weren't two trumpet players, so I played the other trumpet part. I think Soldier's Tale. I might be wrong. One of those chamber pieces that's real modern like that. Okay, so in my opinion, what makes someone a great trumpet teacher is when, okay, do you know what? We can boil it down to this one thing. When they recognize you as an important individual in their life, important enough to invest into you, right? And you're not just one number. And that much I do try to do for my students. Okay? When I said what I won't do is I won't go to your house and stuff like that, like what Dick Schaefer did for me. I can't afford to do all that. Okay? What are some ways to work on melodic expansion, creating lines and runs that flow smoothly in composition or improv? I'll tell you what. The answer to that question is the language. So look at I kind of abandoned my jazz improv series. I did all the introductions and then I stopped. But do a search on here for the video I did on the jazz language. And so the way I approach the jazz language is through motivic improv. So for example, if I'm improvising, that's a motif, a 5-note motif. Now I paired two 5-note motifs next to each other. The first note of the second motif is the last note of the first motif. Now I did 4 motifs. And to demonstrate how this motivic approach works, I'm going to do a different fourth motif. Okay, I changed the last motif. What if I change the last 2 motifs? Okay, you see what I'm doing? So when you learn to improvise motivically, there is no stopping your run. So it's kind of hard for me to do that on command because it has become for me a more natural, subconscious process. But I'm going to try to do this for you now. Anyway, so that was a whole breath of motifs. And what I was doing right there, and it sounds kind of mechanical because I'm trying to do that, right? When you improvise, you shouldn't be thinking like that. But I'm trying to demonstrate, right? When you learn how to just connect motifs like that, the phrases can just keep going and going and going and going and going. And you know what? The reason why it's so easy to play long phrases like that when you improvise motivically is because that's how we speak. That's why we call it jazz language, right? That's why we call it jazz language. Okay? Now, To my knowledge, now I might be wrong. To my knowledge, I am the only person I know that teaches the motivic approach. If someone else teaches this, I would really like to know. But to my knowledge, I'm the only one that teaches this, and I have a very systematic approach to teaching this. Now, I think it's helpful just to know that this exists. And what I would recommend for you is to study. Okay, so let me before I say this, let me tell you that when I look at someone's improvised solo, I do like a percentage in my head, because not all of what we do is going to be motivic like that. So if I play, right, something like that, that's not motifs, that's a scale. Okay? And that's not going to fall in motivic category. And then stuff like what Freddie Hubbard used to do, stuff like that, that's not motivic. That's technical. Right? So not everything we play is going to be motivic. Now, so what we do is we look at the percentage of the solo, how much of the solo is motivic. And with Freddie Hubbard, he was about 50-50, depending on which solo we're looking at. Now, like when he plays Birdland, not Birdland, what's that? Bird-like. When Freddie Hubbard used to play Bird-like, the percentage went more to like 80-90% motivic. And the reason I'm telling you that is because when you first discover this motivic aspect of what we do with the jazz improv, it's best to go to the guys that are mostly motivic. So I would say start with Clifford Brown. Look at Clifford Brown's solos. He's like 90%, 95% motivic. Look at Charlie Parker, 95% motivic. So with what I just shared with you now, look at their, and you know, you don't have to do the transcriptions yourself to see this. Just open up the Omni book, open up a Clifford Brown transcription, and look for these motifs that I'm talking about. There's, you know, the motifs are like words. And in that sense, those guys both had huge vocabularies. And, you know, a lot of people look at their solos and say that, so like, you know, that first motif that I played, right? They'll say, well, that was an E minor chord. Well, yes, you're right. It has the notes of the E minor chord. But the thing is, it keeps coming up. Those exact same 5 notes. Same with the second motif. You can say, well, that's a D minor 7 chord. Yes, you're right. It's a D minor 7 chord. But I'm playing exactly those notes in the D minor 7 chord, not just random notes from the D minor 7 chord. I'm playing those notes. Okay? Now, there are times when we're improvising, where we are just playing arpeggios. So if I play something like this, if I play something like that, that really isn't so motivic. Okay, I am at that point just playing a chord. I don't normally do that kind of thing, but it does happen sometimes. Okay? I hope that makes sense. So yes, the answer to your question is the way you get melodic, and by the way, not just melodic, right? When I'm playing a turnaround or any other kind of harmony, when I play a turnaround, I'm not trying to play an E minor 7 and A7. I'm not trying to play the harmonies. I'm playing language that outlines the harmonies. I just did a series of 8 motifs strung together that go. I went through the same turnaround twice. E minor 7, you can either say C sharp diminished or A7 with a flat 9, D minor to G major, then repeat it again, right? I used language, so it's not just melodic, it's also harmonic. You use the language to play the melodies, you use the language to play the harmonies. And by the way, this is when I tell people that improvisation, jazz improvisation is two different subjects. You have the jazz and the improv. Improv is easy. Almost anybody can improvise and sound good. The jazz stuff, not so easy, because in order to make it sound like jazz, you have to have the language. If someone's just spewing notes out because this chord is here and that chord is there, and you're trying to play the harmonies with these scale patterns and all that stuff, that's not jazz, not in my opinion. And it doesn't matter how hard you swing, it still doesn't sound like jazz. That's my opinion. You know, I judge sometimes, and I'll be listening to these people that they're playing stuff that sounds like a badly written etude with no language in it whatsoever. And it's hard to be a judge when you hear that stuff, right? Then every once in a while, someone comes up and they've got such command of the language. You know, the Grammy bands, I think they stopped doing that. But there have been some guys auditioning for the Grammy band, and 4 or 5, 6 years ago, that have such masterful control of the language. That's why they sound the way they sound. They're awesome. Awesome players. And it's because they've got the language. Okay? But a lot of players coming out of the schools today are being taught that you're supposed to do this over that chord, and that over that chord, and that over that chord, right? And it doesn't sound like music, and it doesn't sound like jazz. Anyway, I hope that answered your question. What does it take to become like a Terrell Stanford or Wynton Marsalis kind of level? Is that even possible? Yes, it's possible. What does it take? I don't want to be so presumptuous as to say what it takes, because okay, I had a teacher one time, and I'm not going to mention names so that it doesn't come up in some search. I had a teacher one time that said the only difference between him, he's a piano player, between him and Herbie Hancock and him and Chick Corea was that those two guys were more well known. And you know what? You don't say stuff like that, right? Even if it's true, which I don't think it is true, you don't say stuff like that. If you think you're better than someone who's considered the best of the best, you don't say so. That's just arrogant. And so what I'm going to say is that I'm in no place to say what it takes to be where those guys are. I'm not in a place to say that. I'm not all-knowing, all-seeing, and I apologize for not just giving you an answer that you might be looking for. But all I could tell you is what it takes to get where I am. And, so I understand what that teacher was trying to say. I understand what that teacher was trying to say, because I do believe that the choices I've made about publicity have impacted how good people think I am, right? And here's the thing is I don't need anybody to think I'm good. The only people that I need to think that I'm halfway decent are the people who are hiring me. I have no desire to be famous. I never had that, right? So I can't speak anyway for those who are, because that's a little bit of what you're talking about when you talk about those guys, is because that's part of the package, isn't it? And by the way, don't take what I'm saying as saying I'm as good as those guys. I don't see it that way. You know, I have a good friend, Dennis Dotson. Dennis Dotson used to be the jazz trumpet player for the Woody Herman band. And I used to see in my head this hierarchy of trumpet players until I heard that he used to do that. You know, Bobby Shue used to have this thing where he'd do two trumpets, him and another famous trumpet player. And so Dennis Dotson had apparently done some of those shows with him as the other trumpet player. And I said, wow, that's amazing. And, you know, and Dennis said to me, and it made all the sense in the world. He said, you know what? The difference between him and Bobby Shue is that they're just different players. It's not a hierarchy. It's not a stratified hierarchy. And I don't think, you know, I don't think it's right to think of it as a hierarchy. I think that's a mistake that comes to our trumpet world because of the educators. I think the educators stratify because, and it makes sense, right? Because they have to put their band people in order. And if you look at my video about musical competitions, you'll see how I feel about that band order. I don't think it really means anything. That's just the opinion of the band director. You get another band director in there, it's going to be a different order. Not entirely different, but there will be some differences. And so when we look at the stratification of professional trumpet players one over another, that's just bogus, right? So, and I'm not saying that's what you were talking about, but so I guess that kind of leads me in the direction of answering your question, really, because what does it take to be like them? The answer, I just had this great epiphany, right? The answer is, to be like them, you have to be like yourself. Because that's who they are. They're doing their own thing. If you're trying to be a copy of them, you're never going to be them, right? You have to do your own thing. And that's where, I guess that's what I've been trying to say in this last 5 minutes, is that's where I'm at in my career. I do my thing. I do my thing well, right? So, and so I think that's how you get to be someone like Wynton Marsalis or Terrell Stanford, right? Is you know, we all still need to have that education. We still have to have the education, but you know, the education, you know what, here's one of the problems with education, right? What they teach you in the education, especially at the college level, it goes contrary to what you need to make a career in music. The music education is all about doing what other people have done. And that's fine, because they're educators, they're academics. Their whole life is spent looking at what other people have done. That's how almost all of academia is like that. The exception is like in the sciences, where they go and look for stuff that's completely different. But in my experience, what people are teaching in the schools is how to be like Wynton, how to be like Clifford Brown, how to be like, right? That's not how you, when you read the music business books, that's the opposite of what you're supposed to do. To be successful as a musician, you're supposed to find your personal traits and find a way to bring those traits out in your music in a legitimate fashion. What we learn in the schools does the opposite of that. What we learn in the schools, so now I'm talking about jazz stuff, okay, jazz or pop. Classical is a whole different spiel because you got to go through the audition process, right? Now, a classical soloist, that's another story. If you want to be a great classical soloist, all of what I'm saying applies. You find your thing. And this goes all the way to the tunes that you practice, right? You choose your repertoire. This is one of the things that I tell people, right? I tell people, because people will say, it's your sound that defines who you are as a player. And I completely disagree with that. It's your repertoire that defines who you are as a player. The tunes you know are the tunes that determine what kind of, so if all you know are brass quintet tunes, but you sound like a jazz combo player, I'm sorry, you're not a jazz combo player, you're a brass quintet player. Okay? Has nothing to do with your sound. If you have an orchestral sound, but all the tunes that you know are big band tunes, or you're not an orchestral player, you're a big band player. Okay? So even to the level of, and for this reason, the students that I teach that want to be pro, and I won't go into that, but it's I don't want to discourage people. Yes, I do want to discourage people. The whole idea of going pro, I've had a good career. This is hard for me to say, right? I've had a great career. What I will say is that people don't know what they're getting into when they do this. I've had a great career, but when people say, I want to be a professional musician, they don't have a clue what they're talking about. Okay? So I do try to be someone that helps them open their eyes to what it is they're trying to get into. Okay? But, so talking about the repertoire that you learn, if I have a student that insists they're going to go pro, then I make sure they understand that the tunes that they learn fashion out the player they're going to become. Okay? So it's a very important part of your development as a player is which tunes are you going to learn? Okay? I have some ex-students that only ever learned the really modern stuff. And that's what they're doing. These guys are touring the world. They're some of the best, I won't say who they are, but some of my past students are considered the best. Most of them are not trumpet players, but they're considered the best jazz players in the world right now. And so, and it's not a coincidence that these guys who are signed with Blue Note and Crossroads and stuff like that, that the stuff that they studied was all that modern, even more like, what's the guy's name? I'm actually the guy that introduced them to this sax player, Kenny Garrett, right? I introduced them in school to Kenny Garrett, and later a whole bunch of those guys ended up playing in Kenny Garrett's band, right? I shouldn't say a whole bunch, but some of those guys ended up playing with Kenny Garrett, and that's the kind of music those guys are playing professionally in their careers. So yes, the music that we pick to choose to master is a big part of going into uh, uh, is what am I saying? It's a big part of what it takes to determine where you're going to go with your music, right? So I hope that answers the question. Okay, so that's a wonderful thing. That's a wonderful thing. If you are inspired by Wynton Marsalis, then that's who you how do I say that? So like learning the tunes that he plays. He's taken a big turn in his career over the years, and he's doing more traditional stuff. And you got to look at what part of it, what he does that inspires you so much. I don't see anything wrong with saying the stuff that he does. I'm going to take these parts that I like so much and then go to the next level and make them mine. Okay, there's nothing wrong. So, let me tell you what my goal was when I was in college days. I told people, and this is now I look back, it's kind of dumb, but it was part of what moved me in the direction that I went in. Right, I wanted to have Wynton Marsalis's sound. I wanted to have Alan Vazuti's technique. I wanted to have Freddie Hubbard's harmonic language. And there was somebody else. There were 4 of them. I can't remember who the other guy was. But yeah, I wanted to be like a mixture of all those guys. And that concept moved me in the direction that. So after a while, I kind of shed all of that. But this was, let's put it this way: those guys, the inspiration that those guys were to me in my life, and yes, Wynton Marsalis was a big inspiration to me. I just won't go as far as to say he was the only inspiration, but I had more Wynton Marsalis albums than anybody else for trumpet. Okay, so they say put your money where your mouth is. That tells you how much I liked Wynton's playing. Okay, I had more of his albums, and I say albums, I'm talking about the records. CDs later, I had more of other players, but with that, when I, up until the point that I was buying CDs, I had more albums than anybody else by Wynton. But yes, I see those guys as booster rockets getting me to where I am today. They helped get me to where I am. The inspiration that they gave to my life helped get me to where I am. So, I think I kind of outgrew some of the aspects. I never outgrew the players. I still love listening to all of them. But when I realized, for example, that I didn't like, for the most part, playing the notes, practicing the notes up above the G above high C, right? That's, I kind of backtracked on that. I still use that range. And I still enjoy the gigs I do that have that range. I do play super C's and super D's and super E's in my on my gigs when it's appropriate. That's the thing, is most of the high note guys are completely inappropriate. The way their thrill for high notes is more important to them than their duty to the band. And I just can't. That's not me. I'm not. All the more power to them. I'm not interested in that. Anyway, so this was a nice long one. Any more questions? I can get maybe one more question in before I go eat breakfast. Huh? Yeah, this was a good one. Thank you guys for your questions. You know, the questions really help me because otherwise I sit here like an idiot trying to come up with stuff to say. You know, I do have some email questions that I didn't get to. And so I might just make videos for those. Thank you. All right. Well, that's it for today. God bless you guys. We will see you on the next video. I do have some videos that are coming out each day that I made last night out on the patio. I'm on vacation right now. I did these outside. It was like 110 degrees out there, but it was actually nice. You know, we get to 90 degrees in Houston, and it's miserable. Out here, 110 isn't so bad. Anyway, so thanks for sticking around. We'll see you guys on the next one. God bless you.